Dr. Zubin Austin, who will be giving us a presentation on competency and professionalism. Dr. Austin is a professor and inaugural holder of the Koffler Chair in Management at the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy. His research focuses on the professional and personal development of the health human resources workforce. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed manuscripts and authored 3 reference texts. He has won awards for his research from national and international groups in 2017, was named a Fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, the highest award for health researchers in Canada. He is also an award-winning teacher, having received the Province of Ontario's Leadership and Faculty Teaching Award, the University of Toronto's President's Teaching Award, and he has been named Undergraduate Professor of the Year by students on 17 separate occasions. I have had the honor to hear Zubin speak in the past, and am confident that you will learn immensely from his presentation. So with this incredible bio, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zubin Austin.
Well, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to speak to you today. You're going to be hearing from 2 pharmacists in a row this morning. Wow. I hope it doesn't confirm that old joke pharmacists like to tell about themselves. And the joke is, what do pharmacists use for contraception? And the answer is their personalities. So hopefully you won't be telling. What a sympathetic audience. I like that. So the topic today is a topic that I hope will be of relevance to anybody in the room, whether you are a public member, a professional member, a council member, a staff member, or a tech guy who at some point is probably going to be needing the services and care a professional can answer. The title of the presentation is, If Competency is Our Answer, Have We Asked the Right Question? And as you'll see over the next hour and 15 minutes, I'm going to be asking a lot of questions. And hopefully at the end of this, 1 or 2 answers may evolve, but please don't expect all questions will be answered by the end of all of this. And so to begin with, what I'd like to do is actually have you think about this question. So at some point, all of us are going to need to trust or rely on the knowledge, skills, and kindness of a professional. Whether it is you thinking about institutionalizing a parent, or you working with a public school board with a child that may have some learning issues, a lawyer, if you're buying a house. There are many, many situations in life where we rely upon professionals. And even though all of you are professionals, sometimes we need to trust the professionalism of others. And in that kind of situation, when we need to trust other professionals, what keeps you awake at night? When you are in a situation where you actually know nothing about the content area that you need to trust someone. Let's say you are dealing with a lawyer, a dentist, maybe a pharmacist. What keeps you awake at night as you contemplate you putting your faith, your trust, potentially your life or that of a loved one in the hands of somebody else? That's actually not a rhetorical question. What are some of the things that you would worry about when you are needing to rely on a professional? Yes?
For me, it's an informed choice. It's not just being given the answer that is the easiest, most common one that they give, but giving me my options so I can look at
Okay. So one answer is that you want to have choices, but not just random choices, choices where you feel confident that you have the information to make the best choice for you. You don't want directives, you want options. Anything else keep you awake at night? Yes?
Information that's evidence.
Okay. So you actually want the information that is based on something, not just opinion, but actually evidence.
Can that professional think about my specific situation, my context, my heritage, my
Okay.
situation?
So is that professional actually sensitive to who you are as a person? Not just you as a series of laboratory tests, but you as a complex person who is embedded within a family, a community, a culture, and a context. All of these are, I think, really important issues to think about, because when we talk about a word like competence, I would suggest that perhaps we are talking about something that is necessary, but insufficient in the context of something as complicated as professional work. The reason I say this is that if we actually look back in time to where and when the word competence suddenly erupted on the scene in the context of professions. If you are as old as I am, you may remember a time when I was in school, we never applied the word competent to professionals. A bladder was competent. A cervix was competent. Muscular organs is the kind of context that we would actually describe competence about. But you wouldn't describe a professional as competent. And in fact, to my ear, even today, competence seems like a relatively low bar. There's nothing aspirational about competence. It's like, yay, you got 60%. That's great. But yet, somewhere in the last 20 years, competence has become all the rage. Competence is important for regulators, it's competent for professional associations, it's even important now for people who work in educational institutions. And where did the idea of competence first erupt in the world of professions? If you do a type of discourse analysis and look back, particularly in the province of Ontario, and particularly through Ministry of Health documents, you will see that competence first started bubbling up in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and particularly in the context of a very unfortunate situation that happened with our colleagues in the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario. In the late 1980s, there were a number of very high-profile cases of sexual misconduct by physicians. And as it would happen at that time, sexual misconduct was actually dealt with not as the criminal issue that it is, but as a professional issue through the college. And there was a perception at that time that CPSO in particular did not manage those cases very effectively. The term circle the wagons was used quite a lot because the idea was that there were a significant number of complainants who had suffered at the hands of physicians. While the actual guilt of those physicians was never particularly in doubt, the penalties that were meted out by the self-regulatory body for medicine seemed disproportionate to the severity of the actual incidents. And as a result, a large public hue and cry erupted, and questions started to emerge about who are all these self-regulatory bodies? Like, if they're not protecting us against something as foundational as sexual misconduct, what's the point of them? And as that question was asked and it made its way through the Ministry of Health and other layers of government, in the early 1990s, you suddenly started to see the emergence of a new discourse of competency. The answer to the question, how do you prevent sexual misconduct, somehow morphed into, let's make sure all professionals are competent. All professionals being competent is a fine and good thing, but I think it's safe to say that individuals who willfully commit sexual misconduct could very easily be technically competent. And how does actually ensuring competence of individuals ensure that they're not going to do things like sexually abuse vulnerable clients? Around that time in the early 1990s, you start to see the word competence, competence assessment, quality assurance, maintenance of competency start to emerge in a variety of different sectors, particularly in the health professions. And today, it's become commonplace and widely accepted that, of course, competency assessment is not only a necessary thing, it is a good and noble thing. And what I fear is that there might be a belief that we think not only is it necessary, good, and noble, if we do that, we've done our job. Once we've ensured competency, all other problems are not going to occur. And that is what I would like to challenge everybody in the room to consider, whether or not the answer to the question, how do we prevent sexual misconduct, equals competency assessment, has that equation actually worked? Has it mattered? And has it actually prevented any of the issues that we actually need to think about? To begin with, I think we need to take a step back and think about all of us in the room who are professionals and try to think about what's so important, special, and necessary about professional work. Many of you may have heard of or read some of the work of an educational philosopher by the name of Donald Schoen. He coined the term the reflective practitioner, and about 20 years ago, this was a very popular thing to talk about, but it's faded a little bit in prominence, and I think that's quite unfortunate. For Schoen, he begins his understanding of what professionals mean to a society by the recognition that life is filled with messy problems. He actually uses that word, messy problems. There are many things in life that do not have easy, clear-cut, algorithmic solutions. Because if you could solve most of life's problems in an easy, clear-cut, algorithmic way, you would have computers. You would have well-trained technicians. You would have individuals themselves looking stuff up in books and on the internet and solving their own problems. But the reasons you actually need a profession of any sort in any discipline is because so much of human life is actually dominated by situations where there are no right answers, but there are only least worst alternatives. Oh, lots of chuckles and smiles in that, because that's probably midwifery in an instant. Least worst alternatives are incredibly challenging because, first of all, they're cognitively complicated. If having the ability to actually proceed and act and look decisive and feel confident when there isn't a right answer, but there's only least worst alternatives to select from, is a really difficult thing. And you have to have a certain amount of cognitive capacity, a certain amount of ethical judgment, and a certain amount of personal wherewithal to cope in that situation. Words like wisdom, judgment, compassion, and care are the words that are often used to help us understand how people make decisions and how people act in situations where least worst alternatives are all that's available. This is exactly why you need professionals. You need people in society that society can trust to exercise these kinds of traits in complicated situations. All of you in the room who are professionals know, as I do, because I too am a professional, I'm a pharmacist by original training, all of us know what it is to be a young person who is smart, well-intentioned, and nice. All of you were that. What does society do or suggest? What do parents push people who are smart, well-intentioned, and nice to do? Become a professional. Because it's a good way, not simply to make a living, but to apply your skills in a way that is meaningful, helpful, and nice. While that might sound like I'm being dismissive, I'm not actually. I think it's a very important insight that the kind of person that becomes a professional is generally not doing it because they expect to become fabulously wealthy. Very few of us as professionals become fabulously wealthy. We make a decent living and we do fine, and as we should, because if your mind is cluttered up with wisdom, judgment, compassion, and care for others, it would be nice if you could, get a car with an automatic transmission so you don't have to worry about changing gears and all of those things that would clutter your thoughts along the way. The idea that there is, as Deanna Williams said earlier today, a social contract between society and professionals is a really important part of things. But it's a two-way contract. Professionals take on a lot of responsibility and have to deal with a lot of complexity. And in return, reasonably expect that they will make a decent living, have a certain amount of respect from that society that they are serving, and have a certain amount of latitude because they're not dealing with right answers. They're dealing with least worst alternatives. And that does require a certain amount of latitude on everyone's part, because if it was a right answer, a professional wouldn't have to be the one doing it. Think about then the kinds of messiness that professionals have to deal with. And here are just a couple of situations we want to consider. A child has been experiencing significant personal stress both at home and at school, and as a result is falling behind. Worse behavioral issues have now emerged that are being treated as discipline problems rather than psychosocial issues. A teacher who knows the child takes the time to talk to him, learns more of the story, and in the course of the discussion, the child breaks down and cries and cries and cries. What do you do if you're that teacher? Do you put an arm around that teacher, around that student? Do you hug that student and say it's going to be okay? Do you provide the baseline human physical contact that one might expect a caring, wise adult to provide to a vulnerable child in that situation? Or do you immediately think the College of Teachers is going to nail me to the wall if I touch a student? What if it's a male student and a male teacher? Does it even matter? Female student, male teacher. What are the implications of regulation and the constraining of professionals in certain areas, all for good reason and good intention, but for this particular child, what is the experience like? A physiotherapist is trying to assess a patient's mobility and joint status and needs an X-ray ordered to do so properly. He approaches a medical resident from the team and is informed that the patient in question isn't mine. So no X-rays orders written. Well, I realize that you're not the attending physician for this, but I just need I can't order the X-ray by myself. That's just a little policy procedural quirk of the institution. But to do my job and to help this patient, somebody has to sign an order for an X-ray. I'm not asking you to do brain surgery here. I'm not asking you to remove a kidney. I'm simply asking you to sign a form. Then there's no potential abuse of power. There's no advantage. Just, oh, patient's not mine. I can't do this. And so the physiotherapist scurries around like a headless chicken looking for someone to sign a form. The patient waits and waits and waits and waits. And everybody has done their job properly. But who ends up suffering as a result? A social worker is trying to help his patient who is homeless and without employment. The patient has just received chemotherapy and is suffering severe nausea at discharge. The patient has no drug plan coverage. The social worker takes several tablets of an anti-nauseant from the nursing station ward stock that the patient has already received and gives it to the patient so he can at least get through a night at the shelter. Is this theft, plain and simple? Is it a social worker using judgment to say, what are we going to do at this point? Do we wait for the Trillium drug plan coverage to kick in for this patient so they can get a couple of doses of anti-nauseant? Do I have to chase all these people down to fill out a form? And that time the person might just leave? Or do we take something we know works for this person that has an inconsequential financial cost, and even though I'm not allowed to do this, is this in the best interest of the patient? Every profession has examples of these kinds of what do I do in this situation? And every professional, including all of us in the room who has been in this situation, would be lying if we didn't say, well, this is the right thing to do, but what's my regulator going to say if they catch me doing this? In all fairness, regulators, possibly more than anybody else, are abundantly aware of this. Regulators over the last 10 to 15 years have started to recognize that regulatory models that are premised on a whole series of lists of thou shalt not, simply cannot adapt to the complexity of professional work, the messiness of day-to-day life, and the real-world needs of what professionals ought to do when faced with these least worst alternative situations. This tension has emerged in the last 20 years because regulators, like educators, like employers, like everybody, have become, I would suggest, so concerned about competency that perhaps we've lost sight of other things. To begin with, the problem might be with what competency is and what it isn't. The dictionary defines competency as the quality of being adequately or well qualified, physically or intellectually. And so it's frankly of absolutely no help in trying to figure out how do you deal with awkward, messy, real-world situations like those we've spoken about. Despite the fact that the definition doesn't necessarily provide any clarity or any operational guidance, it has become the basis for evaluating success, defining readiness for practice in regulation, education, and employment. One of the major deficiencies of competency as a way of organizing ourselves as a profession is that the reality is it means different things to different people. When you use the word competent as a midwife, your regulator might use the word competent in a different way, your patient might use it in a different way, your employer might use it in yet a different way, and a lawyer who might be suing all of you at one point might be using it in a different way. So let's look at what some of the academic literature at least points to in terms of how different stakeholder groups have different perceptions of what competency is and what it isn't. There's an abundance of literature from very many professions, health and non-health, to tell us that when patients think about a competent professional, they tend to think of three things, sometimes shorthanded as the 3 A's. These three things are accessibility, affability, and acknowledgement. Patients or clients want professionals who are there when they need them to be there. They want access. They want affability. They want somebody that's actually nice, who's likable, who's jovial, who can make small talk. And they want somebody who will acknowledge the problems that they are suffering rather than dismiss them, that will acknowledge their concerns and be, as somebody mentioned, respectful of them as a person, not just a series of lab tests. Conspicuously absent from this list, you will see, is that they don't use the word competency. They don't even use the word knowledgeable or evidence-based. And that's not to say that people don't expect their professionals to know things. It's just that patients and clients actually probably have a much higher tolerance for honest error that occurs in the day-to-day practice of a profession than perhaps we give them credit for. How do we know that? If you were to examine complaints records of virtually every profession, complaints about practitioners are almost never due to an honest mistake when somebody says, "Oops, I'm sorry. I tried my best, this was difficult, I made a mistake, I'm sorry." Very rarely in that situation will anybody launch a formal complaint with a regulatory body. What is the most common cause of complaints to regulators in diverse professions? A bucket of things that we would probably categorize as impoliteness, being dismissive, not accepting responsibility, not saying "I'm sorry." In virtually every profession you can study, less than 2% of practitioners are ever complained about. And within most professions, even fewer end up before a disciplinary or fitness to practice committee. And yet, in every profession I know of, for that less than 2%, an elaborate regulatory apparatus evolves, one that requires the 98% who are going about living their lives, doing their job effectively. An elaborate apparatus evolves that pins everybody into the same box. If you look at it this way, and perhaps a bit cynically, you might actually say from a patient perspective, competency is nothing more or less complicated than a kind of interpersonal savvy. As long as you know how to get on with people, you'll be fine. And that reduces something very complicated to something perhaps that's oversimplified, but it does point to this issue, and an important point of reflection, of how much time, energy, and money do regulatory bodies historically have they spent on competency assessment, when in fact what patients really say they want doesn't connect necessarily with that. What do practitioners think competency is? Well, as all of you who actually work in the trenches say or know, it's hard being a professional, and it gets harder every day. What is the day-to-day life of most professionals, regardless of your field? It's about decreasing autonomy, increasing demands, burnout, and fatigue, and environments where legalism dominates clinical judgment. Oh, come on, I'm a human being. I should hug this child that's crying. I should probably call my lawyer before I do that. There's a homeless person who's puking and is being discharged. The cost of these tablets is 32 cents. He's taken them before, it's safe, it'll work, it'll get him through the night, and then tomorrow we can worry about getting him the drugs that he needs, but he has no money. Are you really going to send him out into the night without this? In the context of day-to-day life of practitioners, there is, of course, a huge concern about making mistakes. Smart, nice, well-intentioned kids like to get things right. But what does right mean when you don't have right answers? What does right mean in the context of least worst alternatives? And so for many practitioners, competency becomes a crapshoot. Competency becomes, who else is working with me today? What if I happen to have somebody that I don't get along with or who I don't think is very good? Am I going to be labored with their mistakes? It could be the luck of the draw of, oh no, yesterday was October 31st, and in pharmacy land, that's actually an important day because October 31st means for a lot of people with certain kinds of drug plans, their coverage ends, and now they suddenly have to start paying money. You don't want to be a pharmacist today because now all of a sudden, well, I got that free last month. What do you mean now I got to start paying for it? Why did I just, luck of the draw, get scheduled to work on November 1st instead of November 2nd when it would all be scheduled? easier. Competency from the perspective of many practitioners is as much about good luck and not being in the wrong place at the wrong time as it is about a fundamental trait to themselves. Competency and competency assessment, therefore, ought to take this into account, but it really doesn't seem to. And so for some practitioners, the response is, tell me what hoop you want me to jump through, I'll do it, and hopefully you'll just leave me alone after that. It becomes a somewhat meaningless make-work project that's disconnected from their day-to-day reality and their day-to-day experience. And again, an enormous apparatus, enormous amounts of time, money, and energy get devoted to an activity that might not actually have any kind of protective benefit in the end, if good luck and not being in the wrong place at the wrong time is one of the main drivers of problems. Regulators have an enormously complicated job, as was so nicely demonstrated through Deanna's presentation. Here are just a few things that regulators need to worry about: safety, transparency, accountability, consistency, and fairness. Ultimately, for all regulators, their mandate is to serve and to protect. And increasingly, across many professions, the issue of how do you actually interpret protection is subject to discussion. Is protection an enforcement function, or do you actually protect the public by educating practitioners, by helping practitioners, by providing practitioners with the sense that their day-to-day work is complicated? We get that. That the judgments they need to make are complicated? We get that. And that in an environment where you're dealing with least worst alternatives means that competency, which is a bimodal right or wrong construct, might not necessarily apply very well in that. So for regulators, how is competency framed? It's a juggling act. You have so many different things that need to be simultaneously considered and so many audiences that need to be pleased. It's a wonder that the whole thing just doesn't collapse, because you can't please any of these people any of the time, it seems. I've had the good fortune of being an educator for almost 30 years now, and if any of you are educators, you will know that most of us like being teachers because we enjoy the idea that we are nurturing the next generation. Especially in a profession, the value of professional socialization is what drives many of us to work with younger people, with students. And there is perhaps among those of you that don't work in educational institutions, a very sweet but naive and misguided idea that, oh, it's so wonderful working in educational institutions with these lovely, bright, young, keen people who are going to be our future and take care of us. And while those people generally are nice, bright, lovely, and keen, educational institutions have shifted fundamentally in the last 25 years, and there's been such an enormous move away from valuing professional socialization and instead towards psychometric burden. Most things that educators have to worry about, have to prove, and have to demonstrate have to do with, well, what's the reliability and validity of your assessment? Are you meeting accreditation standards? What's the G coefficient associated with the tests that you're administering? What's the predictive validity of this, that, or the other? Education in a profession historically has been concerned with wisdom, judgment, caring, and nurturing the next generation to work with the kind of complexity we're dealing with. And mainly driven through accreditation practices and processes, it's really shifted now towards some kind of a psychometric view of learning, saying, well, this is a valid assessment, this is a reliable assessment. For many of us, that means in some ways that some of the fun, some of the nobility, and some of, I think, the energy that we might bring to teaching starts to get deflated, because you fill out a lot of forms that are impersonal, that in the name of trying to standardize an educational experience and be fair to everybody, starts to knock the stuffing out of individuals who wanted to become a professional in the first place. The idea of individualizing developmental approaches to education. What works for you might not work for you, might not work for you, but I as a teacher want to figure out what works for you so that you can be the best person you can be. There's very little space left in professional education for that. And so some very important kinds of socialization into a profession start to get lost. And as a result, young people's connection to that profession may not be as strong as it might have been in our generation and could be. And what are the consequences of that when people start to say, oh, well, it's not really a profession, it's just a job. Because once you start thinking of your profession as a job, there's no way I'm going to hug that kid. Forget it. There's no way I'm going to take that 32-cent anti-nauseant and give it to a homeless person because, hey, it's just a job. That's someone else's responsibility, not mine. What do employers look for? It's hard to know what employers think about competency, but if we look at actually the way employment practices work in many professions where professionals are staff rather than independent, autonomous individuals, you can see that there is a big push toward what might be called a production model of care delivery. The notion that every single person in this room is an interchangeable widget. And if you don't like the working conditions here, we wish you well in your future because we'll just find somebody else to slot into your place. Again, what's the message that sends? Is professional work really that commoditizable? Are professionals really that interchangeable? Do you not, because you are a professional, bring a certain and unique way of practicing your craft that should be valued? And in most places where professionals are employees, that's not the way employers necessarily view it. And again, what message does that send? Either implicitly or explicitly, this is just a job. It's not actually a profession. It's not a calling. It's not a vocation. It's just a job. And if it's a job, I go home at 5 o'clock. I don't put my neck out on the line. I do what I'm told to do, but I'm not going to bother firing on all pistons because this is just a job. Somebody else should tell me what to do. And the consequences that occur when professions become jobs is perhaps, and I don't want to be melodramatic, but it actually ought to be for most of us too hideous to even to contemplate. If professionals all suddenly said, I work 9 to 5, especially in a field like midwifery, wouldn't that be lovely for many people? But the reality is professions, you need people in society who are willing to go the extra mile, who are willing to invest their nice, smart, well-intentioned youth into helping people for altruistic reasons. But the quid pro quo has to be society does something back for them in return, rather than simply say, you hugged a child? What are you, some kind of a monster? Over the last 10, 20 years, as competency and competency assessment have become dominant paradigms in education, in regulation, in professional practice, there's also been an enormous amount of literature that has evolved looking at what competency assessment means. And what we know from this literature is that many of the techniques that have historically been used, particularly by regulators, but also by educators, in order to ensure competency, may be of somewhat dubious quality. Let me give you an example. One of the most common ways historically regulators have had of ensuring competency is to require continuing education. You have to take 20 hours a year or 40 hours a year of accredited continuing education. You fill out a form, you go to a nice room like this, you have muffins for breakfast, chicken for lunch, you fill out a form, and then you're competent. As most of us know, there's nothing about simply sitting passively in a room like this for a couple of hours that translates into competency. And there's an abundance of literature from many different fields that shows us that attendance at CE does not translate into practice change, and completion of CE does not predict whether individuals will meet objectively measured standards. And yet, for probably 40% of professions in Ontario, and Ontario is way ahead of every other jurisdiction I know of, mandatory CE is still part of what regulators enforce. And regulators hang their hat on to say, see, we're protecting the public. We're forcing people to go back to school for 20 hours a year. What we do know is that there is a common profile across diverse professions of those who may be at highest risk of what's termed competency drift. The term competency drift is evolving rapidly in this world because it recognizes that competency is too bimodal a construct. Competency is not like blood type or citizenship. You are either this or you are that. Competency drift recognizes that it's a continuum, that people ebb and flow in their competency, sometimes based on context, sometimes based on day of the week, and sometimes based on nothing more complicated than did you get stuck in traffic on your way to work, and so you're just so furious about that, you can't concentrate and be at your best. What we do know is that individuals across the diverse health professions in particular who are at greatest risk for competency drift have certain demographic characteristics in common. The first is that they are older. In most professions where this has been studied, there appears to be a line in the sand at around 25 years after graduation, where at that point people start to really demonstrate some competency-related problems. The second risk factor is individuals who work in sole proprietorships. People who never get a chance to observe other professionals doing their job are at a much higher risk of competency drift than people who work in more collaborative settings and actually see other people like them doing their jobs. And the third are individuals who are internationally educated. That is, individuals who received their primary qualification outside Canada or the United States. It would be fun to speculate about all of this and what you should do about it. It would be dangerous to assume, okay, great, if we have this data, then what we need to do is specifically target this type of person and make sure we do this type of a thing. What's actually of interest, though, to me in all this literature is what is the root cause of all of these, and why does that root cause then result in competency drift? And increasingly there is a belief that the root cause of these particular demographic characteristics, and consequently a root cause potentially of competency drift, is isolation. What so many of these individuals in these different demographic cohorts share is a notion that they are somehow isolated, separate, apart, alienated from their profession. International graduates, well, they're not part of the club. If you are a midwife in Ontario, there's only a handful of programs that you could have gone to, so you'll know each other. You have a certain social ease of connecting to one another. And then there's these people that come from outside who you may not necessarily deliberately try to exclude, but can't help but be excluded sometimes. Sole practitioners, people who never see other people doing their job, are isolated from their profession. And increasingly there is a view that competency drift is linked to social and professional isolation, whether it is self-imposed or imposed from outside. It does appear that one of the best predictors or one of the best inoculations one can receive to prevent competency drift, you might be pleased to know, is to do exactly what all of you are doing right now. Show up. Simply be in the same room, attend events, talk to people, connect to your profession. Because in that way, you do a lot of what psychologists call peer benchmarking. You might not actually observe a colleague helping to deliver a child, but you'll talk about, oh, I had a really hard day the other day. What would you do in this situation? Oh, that's kind of interesting. You'll overhear things. You'll actually get to hear and see and connect to your profession. And more importantly, hopefully, you'll sit with people at tables and start to make friends and start to actually feel a psychological connection and commitment to your profession that will give you a certain kind of strength to overcome all of the pain in the butt requirements that employers, regulators, and educators are constantly imposing on you. Professional isolation has really taken off as an important reason why people run into difficulties in their professions. And so what we need to do is think a little bit about the causes, consequences, and cures of professional isolation. I actually quite like this quote. We work in conditions where society provides little moral guidance to individuals. There is a breakdown of social bonds between the individual and the community. There is a mismatch between personal or group standards and wider social standards, which produces moral deregulation and an absence of legitimate aspirations. What's it all mean? People just don't care. This is a quote from ED in 97, and ED is not some random executive director, and 97 is not 1997. This was written in 1897 by the sociologist Emil Durkheim based on his studies of people who worked in factories. And he coined the term anomie as a way of explaining that this isn't a profession, this is a job. Tell me what you want me to do. I'm going to work from 9 to 5, but I'm not going to invest any of myself in this. Why would I do that? Because you're just going to tell me what to do anyway. This notion that professional work in the 21st century is perhaps uncomfortably similar to factory work in the 19th century is at the core of some of the really pioneering work of a psychologist by the name of Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi. It took me years to learn how to pronounce that name. Csikszentmihalyi, and if you go to airports or like Indigo, you'll see books by this guy all over the place. He's got a bit of a pop psych flair to him now, but some of his initial work really focused on this problem of what he called flow. Flow is that moment when, as a human being, you're firing on all pistons. We all know what flow means. You might experience flow when you are cooking Christmas dinner or Thanksgiving dinner for your family, when you are driving a sports car down a windy road, when you're playing a musical instrument, when you are playing with a child, when you are reading a book that you're just so immersed in, when you're watching a movie or Game of Thrones or whatever it is. Every human being has things that just get them so revved up, so creative, gets them firing on all pistons, and they are at their best. Csikszentmihalyi has focused some of his work on trying to understand, well, this is great. It's great that you're spending all of this flow energy cooking Christmas dinner. But what if you spent 20% of this flow energy in your job or in your profession? How different would things be at that point? And what is increasingly clear is that of all people in society, professionals are the ones that need to do that need to be willing, ready, and able to invest their flow energy in the complications of what they're doing. And yet for many of us, we don't, can't, or won't. Trying to figure out why that's the case is a very important concern. The word engagement is a way of summarizing so much of this. Part of the problem with, to me, the term competence is that the definition doesn't necessarily make any sense, and as we've seen, perhaps it means so many different things to different people. And the bimodal nature, or the binary nature of the word competency, leads us to label people as being either competent or incompetent, which might not necessarily make sense to many of us. There are many situations in life where the opposite of a word isn't necessarily found by simply adding in to it. For example, what would you say is the opposite of the word love? Some of you, probably not too many of you though in this room, but some of you might say the opposite of love is hate. And as I've just said that, I've seen a whole bunch of you go, no. Indifference. Most of you think probably that the opposite of love is boredom, is indifference. I would suggest actually the opposite of competency isn't incompetency, it's disengagement, it's boredom, it's indifferent. You actually don't care enough about your profession to invest anything of yourself to want to remain competent. And no amount of hectoring, no amount of threatening, no amount of filling out forms or attending continuing education units is actually going to overcome indifference. Something else is needed. And perhaps worse, many of the competency assessment schemes that we've developed over the years worsen that indifference and actually disconnect people from their profession even more. This is not to say that competence and competence assessment is a bad thing and we should chuck the baby out with the bathwater. What a terrible analogy to use for midwives. It is, however, to suggest that if all we do is focus on competence and competence assessment, I think we're missing the boat in actually a very big way. That what we really need to do is recognize competence, of course, is important. It's necessary, but it's insufficient. What we also need to think about is what are we doing to actually engage practitioners, to get them to want to remain competent, to get them to connect to their profession. And are we actually doing things like getting people to fill out forms or checklists or all of these sorts of things that might actually be alienating them and making them feel even less connected? Tell me what hoop you want me to jump through and I'll jump through it, but boy, I'm going home at 5:01. I'm not willing to actually invest anything more of myself. I'm not going to find flow in my actual profession. This schematic is a really good way of actually depicting it. And as you'll see, what it suggests is that we find ourselves in flow when the skills that we possess are matched by the environmental challenges that we face. Instead, particularly in highly bureaucratic environments in healthcare, what we find is that you get a lot of people with high skills, but the challenges are low because their hands are tied. They're not allowed to be professional, or they feel there are all these structural disincentives to being professional. So they end up being bored or apathetic. Or they don't have the right skills for the world they're in, but the challenges are ludicrously high, so all they feel is anxiety. Finding that flow channel is a job not simply for individual practitioners, but for employers, educators, regulators, and everybody. So much of this then ties back into a word you're hearing a lot more about in the professions, and that is, weirdly enough, professionalism. Until recently, the word professionalism was used a lot to describe things like, oh, do you have strange piercings and tattoos? No, that's not professional. Or do you show up 10 minutes late for everything? That's not very professional. Historically, we've looked at the word professionalism as a series of observed behaviors. But increasingly, the word professionalism is being used to describe a kind of inner conviction and inner connection to your profession. Every person in this room has sacrificed a lot of time, money, personal energy, and effort to become a midwife. Has it been rewarded structurally, system-wise, and by society as a whole? There needs to be a balance in which the care and nurturing of the professional is part of the equation when we're thinking about what competency is. I'd respectfully submit schemes that are competency assessment schemes that focus on a lot of checklists, a lot of detail, a lot of standards as a way of driving competency may actually be backfiring, because it suggests that something as important and beautiful as professional judgment can be reduced to a list. And if it can be reduced to a list, why do you need professionals in the first place? Thinking about how we create engagement in our professions is not easy, but it's, I think, the next stage in the evolution of what it means to be a regulator, an educator, and a professional. We need to actually give practitioners a reason to stay competent, not simply a reason to not be labeled incompetent. What are the reasons that we collectively, as a profession, are giving our members to want to stay connected? Remember, this is a college system, and the college system implies that we're all in this together. There shouldn't be this hierarchy. There shouldn't be these people tell us what to do. The minute these people tell us what to do, these people tell us what it needs to be competent, that's when a profession simply becomes a job. And so some questions to think about. Do standards of practice, as they have historically been constituted, really protect the public and guide practice? Or are they simply hoops to be jumped through, but only when someone is watching you? Is there evidence to demonstrate that any competency-based system actually prevents harm? Again, think of how much time, money, energy regulators in a variety of different fields have spent developing competency assessment systems. Does it actually work? Should those precious resources and time be dedicated in some other way that potentially could be used to help create a more engaged workforce rather than simply a competent workforce? Competency-based assessment models have been examined significantly. And about a year and a half ago, my research group was commissioned by the College of Physiotherapists of Ontario to do a systematic review of basically all the competency assessment models that have been used by regulators across diverse jurisdictions and professions in the world to see which one works best. The College of Physiotherapists was trying to find, they were going to revise their competency assessment scheme, so they wanted evidence. And so they wanted, so what works best was basically the charge to me. And this was a fascinating project for me to do. And the answer was, all of them work, none of them work. Because at the end of the day, you can find evidence to say self-reporting activities, things like learning portfolios are a wonderful way of ensuring and managing competence, except for people that who it doesn't work in. Complaints-driven processes or mandatory CE is a wonderful way, except for the people that it doesn't work for. Because the fundamental complexity here is that here's one slide. Oh, actually I had two or three. Oh, there's another slide. There are tons of different methods that have been used and studied, and you'll find some evidence to say for all of them, they worked. And you'll also find some evidence to say that it doesn't work. And partly it's because every single person is different, and what works for you won't work for me. And regulatory practices historically have said we need to standardize. In the name of being fair, we need to have one system that applies to everybody. And if you grew up in a family with more than one child, you know that one of the least fair things is when somebody tries to be fair by applying the same benchmark to everybody. Interestingly, of all of these different methods that are listed on these last two slides, the one method that actually has the strongest evidence, and even then it's not all that strong, but I thought it was curious, it was the strongest evidence to suggest it has an influence on enhancing engagement and professionalism, I think someone heard it, was the secret shopper method. The secret shopper method basically involves sending into the practices of unwitting professionals, they don't know, somebody who's an actor and not a real patient. And in the process of that would be really hard in midwifery, actually. But actually, maybe not. You know, you could certainly do it early on. But the idea is that what you do is you send into, let's say, a doctor's office, somebody who isn't really sick. And that standardized patient observes and records the kind of care that's provided, and then feedback is given to that individual. That method and something called 360 reviews, which many of you may be familiar with, and that's where you get feedback from basically everybody you work with, not just professional colleagues, but secretaries, patients, janitors, anybody in your work environment. Those two seem to have the most influence in actually substantively changing people's behaviors. But there are huge concerns with them methodologically. Secret shoppers are a hideously complicated method to introduce because they smack of surveillance. They are incredibly off-putting, and they really send a chill through a profession if a profession knows that secret shoppers are being used. And in fact, in virtually every jurisdiction where secret shoppers were used, they end up being pulled because the profession just rails against them because of the surveillance risk. 360 reviews, while incredibly powerful, are unbelievably complicated and expensive. And so unless you're the CEO of Exxon, very few of us ever get a 360 review. But their value in terms of actually helping to produce engagement and improve the quality of professional behavior is pretty strong. Where does all of this lead us then? It leads us then to a very complicated place. There is no easy answer in terms of what can a profession or a regulator do to ensure competence. It leads us to the point where I think we need to recognize that if we slavishly adhere to the idea that competence is what we want to do, we might be overlooking the importance of engagement. The juggling act that regulators need to do needs to include competence of some sort, but there needs to be concerted efforts to try to engage members in a way that respects their professionalism. And as our view of professionalism is evolving away from tattoos and tardiness, instead towards, do you feel a psychological attachment to your field? Do you ever get into flow when you do your job? Do you feel that you are willing to actually fire on all pistons for your clients? These are the kinds of professionalism issues that are probably more important in terms of helping to guide future directions for this work. One of the most valuable and most unfortunate stories in this whole space actually comes to us from the United Kingdom. Some of you may have heard about 7 years ago of a very unfortunate situation at a hospital. It's called Mid Staffordshire. The Mid Staffordshire Hospital was sort of a hospital in Middle England. And it was a hospital that just did what hospitals do and filled with Middle English professionals. And over a period of about 3 or 4 years, there were a whole series of problems that ultimately resulted in unneeded or unnecessarily hastened deaths of perhaps hundreds of patients. And the conclusion, after years of studying and a royal inquiry into the matter, concluded that the big problem with the Mid Staffordshire Hospital, and a problem perhaps across every hospital in the United Kingdom and perhaps every health setting in the world, was that you had a situation where nobody was to blame and everybody was to blame. If you actually used published competency standards of practice for all of the professions that were involved in the situation, nobody would have breached their profession-specific competencies. Yet hundreds of people died unnecessarily because nothing lined up. You had in that hospital a whole series of people who said, this isn't a profession, it's a job. I go home at 5 o'clock. Well, you showed up at 4:59. I'm going to give you 1 minute of handover, and then I'm going, and now it's your problem. And you had a whole series of tiny slippages that were connected to this loss of professional enthusiasm that in the end resulted in people dying. How do you solve that problem? One of the really important findings of the Francis Inquiry, which studied this whole issue, was to say you don't solve this problem by introducing more standards. You don't solve this problem by having more hoops for people to jump through. You don't solve this problem by further tying people's hands and further disengaging them from their profession. That's probably the reason you had a whole bunch of people who went, "Oh, just tell me what you want me to do." And they all did it exactly to the letter of the law, but it didn't work. The example of Mid-Staffordshire, I fear, is happening today in every hospital in this province, in every health facility, everywhere, because we have an unfortunately large and potentially growing number of demoralized and disengaged practitioners. The only organization within a profession that touches every practitioner's life is the regulatory body. Some people may have gone to Ryerson, some people may have gone to McMaster. Some of you may belong to a professional advocacy group, some of you may not. Some of you may belong to one employer group, some of you may not. But regulators touch every single person in a profession. So regulators have a unique opportunity to steer professions and pull together a coalition that really looks at what is it going to take to re-energize, recharge, and re-professionalize this profession. And so, one of the challenges collectively for all of us is to think about what's the problem we're trying to solve. The problem of sexual abuse of vulnerable patients by physicians was not, could not, and will not be solved by instituting competency assessment. Yet, 30 years ago, that was the answer to that problem. What are we looking at today? Well, some new words have started to be introduced. Quality assurance, quality improvement, professional enhancement. What's the actual problem, and do we have the right strategies to solve that problem? Or are we simply using old techniques, old strategies, and old tricks in a way that might allow us to say, look, we're doing what we're supposed to do, but in the end, hundreds of patients at Mid-Staffordshire die unnecessarily. This is not an easy solution. It's really easy for me as an academic to say, here's the problem, good luck to all of you in sorting this out. And it is a very complicated problem. But again, isn't that why we need professionals in the first place? Because maybe there isn't a right answer. Maybe all we have to choose from are least worst alternatives. And maybe what we need to do is start figuring out what are the least worst alternatives that we have available to deal with this messy problem as best as we can in the circumstance that we have. Thank you so much for your attention. If you're interested in some further reading in this area, I suggest you go this way. And I think we've got some time for some questions or comments from anybody. If you do have any questions, I'd ask you either use the mic or we have people with microphones who will graciously run to your seat side. So any questions or thoughts or comments?
Yeah, thanks for a really stellar presentation. It was wonderful. When you spoke about engagement, I could think about two words. One was time and one was relationship. Because I think the heart of our midwifery work has to do with that relationship that develops over time with the clients that brings with it this incredible sense of responsibility and caring. So we're not caring so much for what our college says, but we're caring for the real live details of this person's life and this person's care. And for that, we need time and eroding of any of these, so often in our profession, I think what happens generally is that people move towards the most efficient way of doing things. And I think this demand for longer time, continued connection to develop more of a relationship with clients is good. That's all I'll say. But
I really liked your use of the word erosion, because again, to me, that connects nicely with the concept of competency drift. It's this grind that seems to happen, where you get these nice, smart, well-intentioned kids who are filled with optimism, excitement, and expectation. They really want to help people. And it gets eroded, it grinds, it drifts away. So much of what you talked about, there's potentially some role for regulators in terms of perhaps rule setting, but a lot of it also has to do, I think, with employers, with funders. Like, there's a lot of moving parts that need to be coordinated. Again, I think regulators are in a unique position potentially to drive this bus because they're the ones that represent everybody, but a lot of this might not necessarily be something that they themselves have full control over. What the things that regulators do have control over are some of the requirements that everybody needs to plug into, and the extent to which those requirements occupy critical cognitive space in a practitioner's mind. If you're really worried about, is my college going to ream me out because I put my arm around a crying child? Let me look up that. What's the policy on crying children? Or what's the policy around stealing drugs from the ward stock with nauseous, homeless cancer patients? If you have a belief that in general, as historically regulators unfortunately have had, that we need to have a rule for every occasion. If as a professional you have a belief that there needs to be a rule that I can look up rather than how am I going to solve this problem and will my regulator back me up on it? That's the shift that I think we're going to start to see over the next decade. A more maybe collaborative arrangement where the messiness of the real world is recognized by employers, regulators, educators, everybody, and perhaps a little bit more latitude is provided to professionals to think, act, and behave professionally, even if that means we don't have an answer for you, because there is no answer. There's only least worst alternatives. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Brandeis. I'm the president of the Association of Ontario Midwives, our professional association. First, I want to say thank you so much for putting language to very complex concepts that I feel like affect our profession in massive ways right now and in society in general, which relates to my first question. I actually have two questions, if I can be indulged for that. So the idea of the difference between a profession and a job, and the idea of I would say an emerging generation of people feeling like just tell me what to do and I'll do it, is something that I absolutely agree is something regulatory bodies can start to shift. But I think there's a move in society at large around overly bureaucratic or overly administrative structures that impact us in addition to our regulatory framework. Mm-hmm. So the Ministry of Health comes to mind, for example, who you referenced many times in your presentation about employers, and really as independent contractors as midwives, our funder is the Ministry of Health, which tends to create many forms to fill in, many hoops to jump through, and can lead, I think, also to that feeling of it being a job rather than a profession. So I guess my question is, how do you see the intersection of this kind of movement towards viewing professionalism, viewing our work as more complex than just a job, and integrating that into the way we deal with structures that don't embody that complexity?
Yeah, fantastic question. And again, there's no easy or simple answer, obviously, to that. Again, this is where I think regulators are in a unique position to really try to start to move things slowly, because if you're dealing with a bureaucracy, it will be slow movement, away from things like the kinds of funding models that all of us work under. I don't know enough about the way midwives are funded, but let me give you an example from my world of pharmacy. So one of the things that we think that pharmacists should be able to do is figure out when there are problems with medications. And if you come to me with a prescription and I don't think it's right for you or there's a problem with it, what one would hope is that the pharmacist would say, I don't think this is right for you. Let me see what I can do to fix it. Until very recently, there was a perverse incentive in the remuneration scheme for pharmacists that biased people away from doing that. Because as a pharmacist, I would get paid to dispense a prescription. That's it. If I have to spend half an hour chasing down a doctor, if I have to, or if I think this isn't right and I'm not going to dispense this prescription to you, I got paid zero for that. And so it became all too convenient for pharmacists to go, it's not going to kill them. It's not right. It's not good, but it's safe enough. And you know what? I'm not paid for this, et cetera, et cetera. Over time, and led in part by our regulatory body, a new system evolved that actually allowed pharmacists to get paid, not a huge amount, but at least it was a token amount, to issue something called a pharmaceutical opinion. So it was basically you got $10 if you filled out a form, not anybody's idea, but you got that said, this is why we're not going to dispense this medication. This is the advice I'm giving to a doctor about changing it. And that was really led by the regulators, just to recognize this is what practice is like. This is what the financial barrier to engagement is all about. We can't fix everything. And lots of people still complain about, it's not enough money, it's a form, it's all of those sorts of things. It's by no means a perfect solution, but it's the least worst alternative. It is a step that was navigated by the regulatory body to try to recognize that the system disincentivized the actual application of professional judgment. Finding those low-hanging fruit and those things and actually trying as a professional as much as possible to speak cohesively and coherently to the Ministry of Health is not something that will happen overnight, but it's a starting point. And so I'm sure in midwifery there are other perverse incentives around your funding, but if you can find a common starting point to start to adjust how that works, it might be a good place to start.
Yeah, your answer is very provocative for me, just in thinking of who typically provides that kind of advocacy that leads funding changes. Mm-hmm. So that's very interesting.
Yeah, and so in our profession, the Ontario Pharmacists Association, I would respectfully suggest at the time this was happening, might not have had the greatest credibility with our government. Which is why it became a safety issue for the college, which is why they legitimately could navigate this. If there are people who are going, you know what, it's safe enough. Well, safe enough might not be good enough. We actually want what's right for the patient, not just what's not appallingly wrong. It was in that context that the regulatory body was able to, in baby steps, really start to push this forward. But it did require a lot of collaboration across the profession.
Thank you. My second question, and it's a brief question, but I think probably requires a very complicated answer, just around the idea of professionalism. If you could speak to how you see who and what defines professional identity. Mm-hmm. Because I think we all agree in a movement towards thinking about professionalism over a specific list of competencies. Mm-hmm. But is it also then the role of the regulatory body, or is it other stakeholders' role to identify what qualities are imbued in that professional identity?
Okay, so you've unleashed the dogs of hell with that question. It's a very important question. One of the first things I suggest is there's a group of medical educators out of McGill University, some of you may have heard of, Cruz, and Steinert. And last year they wrote a really interesting article exactly addressing this issue in the context of medicine. Some of you may be familiar with a sort of a classic medical education concept called Miller's Pyramid. So Miller's Pyramid suggests that one evolves as a professional from somebody who knows things to somebody who knows how to do things. And then they evolve from actually knowing how to do things to showing how to do things. And then eventually to actually doing things. And it's meant to represent the evolution from being a novice to being competent or proficient in a field. So this Miller's Pyramid has been used to guide medical education for a generation, and in this recent article by Cruz, and Steinert, they suggested that the peak of the pyramid should change from does, and another layer needs to be added, and that is. That at a certain point, the internalization of professional identity is really the goal of medical or health professional education. You do not do midwifery, you is midwifery. It actually becomes part of who you are. And that's meant to, in some ways, build on some of this work of Csikszentmihalyi and others who focus on engagement. That when it actually becomes core to your identity, that's when, not with every waking breath and every, that you're not just obsessed with it in an unhealthy way, but it actually, you bring all of your personal strengths and traits to bear in the delivery of your professional work. That sort of is now sort of emerging as this idea, that notion that it needs to be actually integrated and synthesized into who people are. Let me give you an example, and I'm sorry to go back to a pharmacy example. You've heard quite enough about pharmacists today, but it may actually help illustrate some of this for you. So about 12 years ago, my father had a heart attack. And so being the dutiful son, I schlepped all the way up to South Lake Hospital in Newmarket, which is where he was kept. And I found, visiting all the time, I found myself unable but to be a pain in the butt to everybody who was there. And so I would constantly be asking questions about, okay, what medications? Is this in normal saline or D5W? What's the flow rate here? All the things that I happen to know as a pharmacist. And so, in advocating for care of my loved one, I, was exercising in a personal space my professionhood. And so this actually, he recovered well, but this led me to wonder, I wonder if this is common. And so I actually had a master's student who did this as a study. And the objective of her research was to identify what happens when pharmacists become patients or caregivers. And the hypothesis was that that's exactly what would happen to, what happened to me would happen to everybody. Much to my surprise, it didn't. And what actually ended up happening was that pharmacists in the study, it was mainly a qualitative study, they would say things like, well, right now it's more important for me to be a mom instead of a professional. Or sometimes you really need to trust that the doctors know what they're doing. A curious statement for a profession whose bread is buttered on the fact that we actually don't trust doctors to do this on their own. That's why you have pharmacists to double check. What her research actually pointed to was this notion of incomplete or imperfect professional identity formation. That what happens is that in a profession like pharmacy, what tends to happen is that pharmacy becomes a coat that you wear at a certain point, and then you take it off. For whatever reason, people don't, the pharmacists in this study, didn't actually leverage. You think now, when it counts the most, you're going to leverage everything you've got to advocate for the care of your loved one. Didn't happen. And in fact, when you look at the literature, the only profession where it does seem to happen to some degree, but not even as much as one might think based on stereotype, is medicine. Nurses don't do it. I don't think anyone studied it in midwifery. But it's a great study, especially when it has nothing to do with birth. But you're well-trained health professionals. If your father had a heart attack, God forbid, how would you behave? And what the experience from every non-medical profession points to is that we don't. We conveniently forget. Sometimes we even go out of our way to hide the fact that we're healthcare professionals and maybe we ought to know things about this. Partly it's might because, well, if I disclose I'm a health professional, maybe they'll make me make decisions. And I don't know anything about cardiology. I don't know anything about this or that. This incomplete or imperfect professional identity formation, which is unique, or the complete identity formation, which apparently is unique to medicine, probably doesn't occur now either. That there's been enough social change and enough sort of societal evolution that even physician socialization education doesn't ever get to that is quadrant or is peak of the pyramid. A really good way of testing professional identity formation is a study like this. So any of academics in the crowd, great study. I'm very happy to share any of the stuff that we did in this study with you. This very long-winded response to your question, though, speaks to a couple of points. A, is it even realistic? I've painted it in a rosy tone and said, yeah, we need to have people engage in their professions, blah, 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 blah. A very legitimate alternative hypothesis would be, it's not realistic. There's no such thing as professions anymore. Everything is a job. I don't like that. I don't want to live in a world where nobody feels that they need to or can behave professionally. But as a researcher, I have to be open to maybe that is actually the path that we are on. I do think, though, that there are ways of encouraging, incentivizing, role modeling, rewarding, recognizing, all of those sorts of important things, that kind of more perfect professional identity formation. If we can't do it today, maybe the best thing we can do today is try to rip away the things that are going in the opposite direction. The forms you have to fill out, the hoops you have to jump through, the competency assessment requirements that don't make any sense that we make people go through. If we can't solve the problem in a positive way, perhaps what we can do is start to remove some of the things that we have control over that we know might be irritating professionals to the point where they just throw up their hands and go, what's the point anyway? So that cookie cutter checklist of this, thou shalt do this, thou shalt not do that, all of those sorts of things, and finding ways of actually respecting and encouraging the expression of professionalism. Wow, that was a long-winded answer. Oh, you should never applaud an academic for giving you a long-winded answer.
Hello.
Hello.
My name's Jasmine. Thank you so much for such an interesting and astute talk. One of your points that I found particularly compelling was your point around flow energy. And for, being helpful, nice, people who, want meaning in our work, that's a really compelling idea. And yet persistent within private and public discussions throughout our profession is this theme of work-life balance. And so there's a tendency, I think, or an inclination to sometimes self-limit our output of flow energy to be self-protective. Mm-hmm. Could you speak to the challenges, the competition between flow energy and burnout?
Yep, great question. I don't have a lot of evidence to this, but my observation is that for most of us, burnout occurs when we are doing meaningless, repetitive, bureaucratic work. Very few of us burn out in the actual day-to-day practice of something that we actually enjoy doing and when we feel we're being helpful. We as professionals will put up with a lot of crap from people, but where we have incredible lack of tolerance is when organizations impose a similar level of crap on us. And typically burnout is not associated with the actual act of the profession. It's everything that goes around it. It's should I put my arm around this child? Yeah, I want to, but I shouldn't. But I want to. I shouldn't. I'm just giving up on all of this. Should I steal a tablet from Wardstock to give somebody who's going to be throwing up in a homeless shelter? What's going to happen to me if I do? It's those kinds of issues rather than the act itself that's I think one of the major drivers of burnout. In large part, your point also addresses the earlier issue about needing time and needing relationship. Relationship is a huge inoculator for many of us to burnout. If we feel we have supportive peers, if we feel we have the respect of the clients that we serve, if we have the understanding of those who manage us, we can usually be relied on to do our jobs. Where burnout occurs is when you're doing what you think is the best thing for your client and you're not getting respect for it, or even worse, you're actually getting whacked on the head for it. Those are the sorts of, I'd say, to me, the perspectives we actually really need to look at. And they feed right back into that notion of allowing professionals to be professional in a way that respects the skills and knowledge and judgment that they actually have. Where burnout becomes a big, big problem is when, okay, so if I put my arm around this child, how many forms am I going to have to fill out now? Who am I going to have to talk to about this? How many meetings am I going to have to endure? That's that erosion and slow degradation of professional ethic and internalized sense of professionalism that I hope we can find baby steps ways of trying to counteract. Thank you.